All right, what up, kids? We are doing another chapter. Same disclaimer as always. I don't think I have to go through this again with you, but remember, this is a gross oversimplification, especially this chapter. This chapter is a relatively long one with a lot of things going on, so just keep that in mind. Okay, so we are going to be talking about the Gilded Age. This is chapter 16 and 17 of your textbook. The Gilded Age is a time period of immense economic prosperity for some in America, and then there's going to be a consequence of that we're going to discuss in a later chapter. So, post Reconstruction, the government becomes very laissez faire. We'll talk about what that means. As such, big businesses take over the American economy and government. Labor unions form to fight the injustices of big business. We also are going to have a conclusion, for lack of a better phrase, of our Native American story. And we're also going to talk about European and Asian immigration and backlashes to that. So there's a lot of things that happen in this chapter. Don't freak out. It's okay to know each component on its own, and then we'll get to the consequence of this chapter later. Okay, so during this time period, there's going to be a huge growth in business. And this is actually going to sound a little familiar to what we talked about all the way back in an earlier chapter when we talked about why does the United States industrialize. So we're looking at almost the exact same reasons here again. Sometimes this is called like the second or even third industrial revolution. The real reality here is that America is going to be industrializing on steroids. So why does it grow so much now? I can think of 6 reasons, in no particular order. Number 1, abundant natural resources. Whatever resource your business needs, we have it. In fact, that's one of the things that makes America perhaps the most fortunate continent, at least for the United States, the most fortunate location in the world. We have every major resource you could ever possibly need. Next, number 2, rapid spread of technological innovation. Again, we talked about this before, but the basic idea here is that as technology grows, more technology grows, and then that leads to more innovations. Number 3, a rapid supply of laborers. So there's going to be a lot of people in America. Not only do we have 4 million former slaves that could be used as potential workers, we're also going to have a huge influx of immigration after the American Civil War. That's going to lead to significantly more people coming here. So because of that, we've got lots of people available to work. Number 4, expanding markets to sell goods. So as the world, ironically, becomes more peaceful post-American Civil War, there are more places to sell things. We're going to get to this fancy word known as imperialism. We're going to talk about that next chapter, but that's also happening during this time period. You may remember it from world history last year. What was that, 4? Okay, number 5, there's money available for investment. This gets a little esoteric for a US history course, but what really matters here is that there are people that are willing to lend money to businesses to make a profit. So that is a good way for businesses to grow. And then finally, there's no government regulation or interference. There really are no rules for businesses during this time period. They can pretty much do whatever they want. And because of this, businesses are going to grow. There's going to be some harsh consequences to that, though, and we're going to get into those in this chapter. By 1913, the United States was the largest industrial economy in the world. In 1880, for the first time, the United States had more factory workers than farmers. By 1890, 66% of the country worked for wages. And during this time period, over 11 million Americans are going to move to cities and away from farms. Now, you don't have to memorize any of those specific sets of data, but that's just indicative of what's happening during this time period. Now, the biggest industry, as always, that leads to American technological growth during this time period is going to be the railroads. Think of the railroad as being bigger than cell phones are today. After the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad, the railroad industry grew tremendously. After receiving funds from the federal government, the states, and private individuals, the industry began to encompass all parts of American life. Like, the map of the world literally changed because of the railroad. because railroads could travel so far and so fast, well, there became this necessity for something called time zones. So, like, what time is it in New York versus what time is it in Chicago? Those places are pretty far apart from each other. A railroad can get there in a day, but is it noon everywhere at the same time? No. The railroad actually necessitated the idea of having time zones to make sure that railroads arrived when they thought that they would. There you go. Now you know. Anyway, um, along with the growth of the railroad industry, we're going to have, again, this is kind of a weird thing to put here, but it's an example. There are a lot of businesses and a lot of technological growth during this time period. All we have to do is focus on one. So I'll focus on the biggest. The biggest aspect of economic growth. Thomas Edison is an inventor, and that's actually kind of a misnomer. He is an inventor, but that's actually not really fair to him. And what I mean by that is that he's actually kind of a business manager. He owns a business where people invent stuff, and he's going to take credit for their inventions. In a lot of ways, he's kind of like Elon Musk. Elon Musk did not make SpaceX. Elon Musk did not make Tesla. Instead, he became the biggest investor of it, and he's going to empower other people to use their inventions and market it and make money. Thomas Edison, he's kind of like that. He basically has a giant workshop where several inventors are going to be working, and then whenever they invent something, he takes the credit and basically said it was his. Now you know. Anyway, he becomes indicative of the technological growth during this time period. He's going to be involved with the invention of the light bulb, the phonograph, the microphone, the motion picture camera, picture and film, and the storage battery. Basically, all the components that eventually led to your cell phone really started with Thomas Edison. Can't overstate his importance. On top of that, during this time period, there's going to be this new thing known as advertising and marketing. It's going to sound strange to you because you live in a world that's run by ads, but in early America, and now we're kind of like in middle of America and timeline, whatever, uh, that didn't really exist. So during this time period, they're going to start making more advertisements to inform you of the products that are being created. Can you imagine a world without ads? Ah, that would be nice. Anyway, during this time period, we're going to have a lot of business competition. In fact, one of the few things that pretty much every American seems to know is that competition among businesses is good. Okay, well, why? Why is competition among businesses good? Well, it's good for us as consumers. And what that means is that if businesses are competing with each other, they're going to compete for your money. So they want to make the best possible product at the lowest possible price. So as a consumer, business competition is really good. You want Apple and Google to be fighting over who can make the best phone because that means that you're going to get better phones and you're going to get them for as cheap as possible. That's the idea behind business competition. Businesses are going to be forcing or fighting each other for your money. Okay, so then what's the bad news? That sounds great. What's bad about that? The problem here is that the number one expense of any business is its labor. And what I mean by that is that you, the employee, are the biggest expense for any business. So what businesses have a natural incentive to do is to get you to do as much work as possible for the least amount of pay. No business gets rich by paying their employees a lot. So the consequence of business competition is that one of the easiest ways for them to make money is to pay you less. Or if they aren't selling a lot of products, another way a lot of businesses make money is by laying off all their employees and saying, hey, look at all the money we're not spending anymore. Happens all the time. And that's the downside to business competition. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of examples of big businesses during this time period. There's hundreds of big businesses during this time period. I'm going to focus on two because they can teach us some vocabulary words that we're going to have to know for the AP exam. So the first guy that we're going to talk about is this dude named Andrew Carnegie. Some people say his name is pronounced Carnegie, but that just sounds silly to me. Like no one says Carnegie Hall. It's Carnegie Hall. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm a West Coaster, whatever. East Coast is what it is. Now, uh, Andrew Carnegie realizes something. He realizes that to get rich, you got to get involved in the railroad industry. But like by the time that he enters the railroad industry, it's already kind of like what's known as a mature industry, which means that like all the money that could be made on the railroads kind of already been made. So what is Andrew Carnegie going to do to get involved and to make some money? He decides that what better way to make money than to be the supplier of steel. So railroad lines are made with steel. Who makes that? The railroad cars are made with steel. Who makes that? We're building these new buildings called skyscrapers that go vertically in the sky, made with steel. Who makes that? The answer is Andrew Carnegie. So ironically, he wanted to own a railway line, but he couldn't pull that off. So instead, he owns the basis of like the building block of American capitalism during this time period. It's actually pretty smart. If you can't own a railroad, why not own what it works off of? Maybe you can't make money anymore making a new cell phone, but maybe you can make money as a cell phone carrier. They all have to work off of that, right? So that's basically Andrew Carnegie's idea. Now, what Andrew Carnegie practices is something called vertical integration. And what this means is that he wants to control all of the aspects of making his product. So he wants to own the mountain that the iron ore comes out of. He wants to own the railway line that takes the iron ore out of the mountain to the factory. He wants to own the smelting factory that smelts the iron into steel. And he wants to own the delivery network that transports the steel to the customer. Basically, he doesn't want to have to spend any money outside of his own company to make his product. You can actually think of this as being very similar to like mercantilism, right? So the idea behind mercantilism is that you want to keep all the money in your empire. Well, that's kind of what he's doing here with Carnegie Steel. He wants to keep all the money inside of his own company. And by doing this, he becomes one of the wealthiest Americans to ever live. But he's poor in comparison to, oh no, sorry, next slide. Darn it, I hate when I do that. A better teacher would actually have this prepared ahead of time, but as you can tell, I'm not. By the way, my dog is not sitting with me today. I'm actually at school recording this today. You guys are on summer break, but I'm here at school working, and this is what I chose to do. So here's proof that I actually did work today. Okay, so as businesses start making more money, we get to this point where the average business owner, or like these big business owners, they basically have more money than anyone. So the question becomes, is there some sort of a moral obligation that the wealthy have for their wealth? Like, you have all this money. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. You have more money than your entire family could spend in 1,000 lifetimes. What do you do with that money? Andrew Carnegie, he writes it's not a book, it's kind of like an essay, and it's called The Gospel of Great Wealth. And basically, in this essay, he implies that it is the duty of the wealthy to use their money to build things for the public good. So for example, I mentioned before Carnegie Hall. That is a music hall in New York, and that was built by Andrew Carnegie. And tickets are at a reduced cost to attend, and it's one of the nicest music halls in America. That was built by Andrew Carnegie. Nobody else would have built that, but Carnegie built it with his money. If you go to New York, there's a bunch of museums and libraries, and there's Grand Central Station, and all of those places are free to visit. These things are going to be built by the super wealthy. The basic idea here is that like you have a lot of money, you are like a steward of that money, meaning that like that money's not yours. That money really is everyone's, and you should do something worthwhile with that money. That's going to be the belief of Andrew Carnegie, In your English class, you're probably going to read some excerpts from the Gospel of Great Wealth. But essentially, Andrew Carnegie says that if you are a wealthy person that does not use your money for good, you basically have lived a selfish and like meaningless existence. So the idea is the people that have wealth should consider that like a public trust, and you're supposed to do something for the betterment of the world with your money. That's going to be the basic idea of the Gospel of Great Wealth. And a lot of big business leaders at this time period take that to heart and actually do spend a lot of their money on public goods. Okay, so we talked about Carnegie. Carnegie's pretty rich, but like let's talk about the richest and possibly most attractive person to ever live. Now, how attractive are we talking? Well, John D. Rockefeller by himself is 2% of the entire US economy. So while people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk think that they're wealthy, none of them is 2% of the entire US economy by themselves. John D. Rockefeller was. So this is an unimaginable level of wealth. It is insane how much money that this guy has. How does he do it? Well, John D. Rockefeller is going to take over a company known as the Standard Oil Company. He technically starts it, but that's neither here nor there. He realizes that oil is what's going to power the next like iteration of America. And it turns out we got a bunch of oil just sitting under the ground here. We've been using oil for centuries in like humans. Mostly we've been using whale oil for the last 100 years. But now we found that we actually have oil that doesn't involve massacring a bunch of whales, that is right beneath the Earth's surface or whatever. So he decides that he wants to be the biggest distributor of oil. And not just the biggest, he wants to be the only distributor of oil. Here's what I mean. Andrew Carnegie is going to start his company known as Standard Oil, and he's going to practice something called horizontal integration. I think I just said Carnegie. I meant Rockefeller. Whatever. I don't have time to edit this. So the idea behind horizontal integration is that Rockefeller wants to be the only person selling oil. Carnegie practiced vertical integration. He wanted to control all the means of production of his product, right? Rockefeller instead wants to be the only person that you can buy oil from. So Rockefeller is going to be like if McDonald's bought out Wendy's and The Habit and Carl's Jr. and In-N-Out. The only burger you can get is a McDonald's hamburger. That's horizontal integration. What ends up happening here, and again, I don't have the exact number in front of me, but within a couple of years, Rockefeller is going to control 90% of the entire nation's oil, which is going to be really a huge chunk of the entire world's oil supply at this time period. Not a lot of other countries are making oil, but that's another story. So he controls 90% of all the oil production in the United States. And oil is going to be something that pretty much every American is using every day. That's a lot of money that this guy's going to make. The way that he would do it is he would basically try to destroy other businesses. How do you do that? Okay, so let's pretend that Rockefeller has I'm going to call it a gas station just to make it easy for you. Gas is not the same thing as oil, but just for comparison's sake. Mullen has a gas station on one corner on D Street. Rockefeller is going to open up a gas station on the other corner of D Street. We're selling basically the same product. Now, I sell gas for $5 a gallon. Rockefeller is going to sell gas at his gas station for $3 a gallon. It's basically the same product. Which business are you going to go to? Duh, you're going to go to Rockefeller's, right? It's significantly cheaper. Rockefeller is basically going to make the price of his product really low and force every other business to like collapse and go out of business. I have to sell my gas station, and now Rockefeller is the only person selling gas in Laverne. Now that Mullen's company is closed, Rockefeller decides, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and up the price of gas to $7 a gallon to make up for all the money I lost. Now there's no competition. Horizontal integration is how you work your way up to a monopoly. And monopolies in America are bad. We'll talk about why in a minute, but that's essentially how this happens. Now, speaking of, monopolies are bad. The reason why monopolies are bad, go back to what we learned about 17 minutes ago. Business competition is good because it means lower prices and it means a better product, right? But what if there is no competition? There's only one of this product and you have to buy it from this one person. That's what ends up happening with a monopoly. And Rockefeller is going to form a monopoly over oil. He's the only one that sells it. You have to pay his price, even though that kind of hurts every other business. Now, the government doesn't necessarily like monopolies because the American public doesn't like monopolies. So the government tries to make monopolies illegal a couple of different ways. Now, Rockefeller's not stupid. He realizes that the government's trying to make monopolies illegal. So he goes, okay, fine. We're not a monopoly anymore. We're a trust. Okay, so what's a trust? Let's go back to that gas station story. What a trust is Mullen has his gas station on one side of the street. Rockefeller has his gas station on the other, right? What happens here is we're going to form a trust, which means we're not really going to compete with each other anymore. We're going to work together and basically pool our money together. So 1 month, my gas is $5.50 a gallon and Rockefeller's is $4.75. The next month, mine is $4.75 and Rockefeller's is $5.50 or whatever. The thing is, it doesn't matter which gas station you go to. At the end of the night, we pour our money into the same bucket. So it looks like there's competition, but there's not. This is actually kind of how Las Vegas works to this day. They don't care if you walk up and down the strip and go to a bunch of different casinos. They don't care because the casinos basically dump all their money into one giant bucket at the end of the day. Like all of the Vegas casinos are really owned by one of two companies. So they don't care really which one you go to. Not really. The competition in Vegas is fake. And this is what happens in America. It looks like there's competition, but there's really not. Now, what this leads to is a crazy amount of corruption in government. And we're going to look at corruption in several different levels. But basically, you got someone like Rockefeller, who by himself is 2% of the US economy. You better believe he's going to have some power and some sway over what happens here, right? What ends up happening here is that Congress is going to end up becoming very corrupt during this time period. How worthless is the president during this time period? Garfield's going to be shot and incapacitated for over 80 days before he dies, and most Americans don't even know what happened, nor do they care, and it has no effect on the running of the country. That's how worthless the president was during this time period. Now, what happens here is that Congress is really going to be calling a lot of the shots, but Congress is basically going to be controlled by big businesses. Why? Well, big businesses kind of write the checks, as it were. Maybe they can fund the election campaign of a politician, and now that politician owes them a favor. At this time period, big businesses are the ones paying a majority of taxes. The average American doesn't really pay taxes because there is no income tax at this time period. Big businesses do. They pay taxes, so they're the ones that are funding the US government through taxes. So obviously they're going to want to have a say in what happens here. Okay, so that's one way to look at it. Now, on top of this, we're also going to have local level corruption. So not only is the national government corrupt, but the local government is going to be corrupt as well. So what's weird is that voter turnout in America during this time period is like 99%. In most recent US elections, the highest voter turnout we've had is like 67%. So why on earth is voter turnout so high? It's probably because voter turnout is not actually genuine during this time period. What's going to happen at the local level is that there's going to be some serious corruption that's going to lead to certain people getting jobs. Okay, so let's just say that, let's see, I'll pick somebody at random. Mr. Ritchie wants to become the mayor of Laverne. The problem here is that Mr. Ritchie is not really well liked among the people of Laverne, I guess. That's not true. He actually is very well liked, but this is just, whatever. If I was doing this in class, I'd pick one of you at random, okay? So Mr. Ritchie wants to become the mayor. He can't win on his own. So what does he do? He turns to someone called a political boss. And that political boss is going to run something called a political machine. So a political boss is think of almost like a gangster or a mob boss. And they're going to run a political machine. A political machine is kind of like a gang. And what that political boss is going to do is going to get a bunch of votes for that person. So the political boss is going to get a bunch of votes for Mr. Ritchie. The political boss does not run for election themselves. They help someone else get elected. Now, fast forward a couple of weeks, Mr. Ritchie is now the mayor of Laverne, but see, here's the thing. Maybe a new government job opens up. Maybe, I don't know, the postmaster or the mailman retires and we need a new mailman. I'm going to call the political boss is going to call Mr. Ritchie up and say, hey, I need you to give my buddy Jimmy a job, and he's going to be the new postmaster. Now, who's Jimmy? Doesn't matter. Is Jimmy qualified? Doesn't matter. Can Jimmy read? Doesn't matter. The political boss tells Mr. Ritchie, this is who you're giving that job. And Mr. Ritchie basically has to do it. What ends up happening during this time period is that these political bosses, who nobody ever votes for, end up really running a lot of cities in the country. Specifically big cities, like New York City is going to be run by a political boss. That political boss has more power than the actual elected officials during this time period. That's how corruption works. For example, there are hundreds of political machines and hundreds of political bosses. The only one you ever have to know is Boss William Tweed. So Boss Tweed is the guy that is going to manage a political machine. The political machine is called Tammany Hall. That is the one that you're going to have to know for the AP exam. So Tammany Hall is basically an area of New York City, and Boss Tweed's going to control it. And he's going to be super involved and super duper ultra corrupt. Like, he's going to be stealing like $70 million of like government money during his time period. Okay, so how do we fight this? Like, a big reason why political bosses come to power is that they're going to get votes mainly from illiterate immigrants. We'll talk about immigrants in a minute, but a lot of those votes that the political bosses are getting are coming from these illiterate immigrants. This is back at a time period before voter registration. So how do you convince a bunch of illiterate immigrants that someone's a bad guy? Like, how can we convince people that Boss Tweed is so bad when most of them can't read? Well, you use something called a political cartoon. So Thomas Nast is a political cartoonist, and you are looking at one of his political cartoons. Now pretend you can't really read English, and you see this. You, by the way, at the time period, you would know that that was Boss Tweed. Does this dude look all that trustworthy? He seems a little shady to me, right? And that's actually going to be what brings Boss Tweed down. A bunch of cartoons are going to make it so that way you know, maybe that guy doesn't seem as trustworthy after all. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's the connection the College Board likes you to make. So that's the one I'm going to make. Okay, moving on. Okay, so to recap, there are two ways the government is corrupt. Political machines are going to give jobs to unqualified people, right? So we just talked about that, right? The postmaster is going to be the political machines or political bosses, or the same thing, friend. And businesses are going to form trust to control the economy and government. So those are two problems that we're having during this time period. How do we solve each problem? How do we solve this corruption? Well, let's look at each one. So, how do we stop people that are unqualified from getting government jobs? It's called civil service reform. Essentially, the government's going to make a series of tests. It's called the Pendleton Civil Service Act. The government's going to make a series of tests that are going to prove that you are capable of doing a government job. So for example, you want to be a teacher? Well, you have to have a degree in the subject that you want to teach, and you have to have a certification from the state that proves that you are competent at it. That way we don't have a bunch of like crazy, illiterate, incompetent people trying to teach our kids. That's the idea behind the Pendleton Civil Service Act. People should have to prove that they're capable of doing a job, not just that they have a friend in government or a friend in business that can give them a government job. You have to prove that you're capable of doing it. And if you can't pass that test, whatever that test is, it's different for every government job. But if you can't pass it, then you don't get that job. Simple enough, right? So that's the way that we can solve the idea of political machines with corruption. The harder one to solve is going to be, how do we solve this government corruption, this big business corruption? Well, the government's going to try a couple different attempts to fix this. The first one is called the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it does exactly what it sounds like. The idea behind the Sherman Antitrust Act is that it's going to make trusts illegal. Now, the problem here is that in reality, the Sherman Antitrust Act isn't really all that powerful on its own. Big businesses aren't stupid, and they're going to find ways around the Sherman Antitrust Act. But it is a tool that the government has to try to break up harmful trust, even if it's not super powerful in reality. In a later chapter, we're going to talk about a president who finally uses the Sherman Antitrust Act, and then we're going to talk about future antitrust legislation that's significantly stronger. But for now, this is at least an attempt to try to control big business, even though it doesn't really work all that well. Moving on. Okay, so we've kind of already talked about this topic as well. Again, this is called the second industrial revolution, and we had a previous chapter talk about the first. The good news is in America that once we do something once, we basically just repeat it. The same thing's going to happen with the world wars. Spoiler alert. Now, during this time period, there's going to be a lot of factories that are going to be created, and these factories are going to predominantly use unskilled labor. Again, we've talked about this in a previous chapter, but in case you forgot, the idea behind unskilled labor is that you're not going to be some skilled artisan who is making a product from start to finish. You're going to do a very simple part of a bigger process of making something. And really, I can train anyone to do it in about 5 minutes, and then you could do it for the rest of your life. And if you break your arm and suddenly can't do that job, I can very easily find anybody off the street to do the same job that doesn't have a broken arm. Or if you say, hey, I really need a pay raise, I'll find someone off the street that'll do it for what I'm offering. That's unskilled labor. The thing is, whenever America industrializes, and we already did it once, we're going to do it again, that is going to lead to more and more unskilled labor. The problem is, who wants to pay a lot of money for unskilled labor, right? If I can get any, like, I don't know, person off the street to do a job, why would I want to pay them $150,000 a year to do it when I can probably find, I don't know, some kid that'll do it for $5 an hour, right? Or less. You'd obviously, if you're a business, remember, if you want to compete, you have to have the lowest prices possible. The best way to have low prices is to basically not pay your workers well. So my point here is, as America industrializes, the value of labor monetarily goes down. So, okay, if you're an unskilled laborer then, how do you protect yourself? As an individual, a unskilled laborer is essentially worthless. No offense, but they are, right? Because again, you're easily replaced. But if you can form a collective, if you can form a group, then you're really powerful. So for example, and this happens all the time, people that pick up garbage, like garbage delivery guys or garbage truck guys, that is considered unskilled labor. And as such, it's not really well paid. At least you wouldn't think it was. The thing is, though, whenever the garbage workers get annoyed at the working conditions or their pay, they have formed a labor union, and they decide, you know what, we're just not going to pick up trash for 2 or 3 weeks. See how much you like it when the trash just piles up on the street. And suddenly, because all of them agree to stop working in a region, now you are desperate to have this problem be solved. You'll pay them whatever they want to take the trash away again. That is essentially how a labor union works. As an individual, you don't have a lot of power, but as a group, you have a ton of power, especially if you can all agree to work together. That's how labor unions work. Okay, so here's the basic formula for how labor unions are going to work. Your textbook's going to give you about 10 different examples. You really only have to know like 2 or 3, so long as you know the formula, and here is the formula. You can pause and copy this down however you want. I'll go ahead and read it and explain it to you as I go, but here it is. So, workers always want more money and shorter working hours. Like, duh. Everybody wants to get paid more, and everyone wants to work less. I've never met someone that goes, man, I really wish I could just work longer and make less money. I'm so sick of making money. I wish I spent more time here, but made less. That would be great. Nobody ever says that. So, workers always want more money. To get more money, they form a labor union. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that owners don't want to pay a lot of money for unskilled labor. If you're easily replaced, why would I pay you a lot of money? So what happens? In order to get what they want, a labor union is going to go on strike, which means they're going to stop working until the factory loses money or shuts down. And then the factory owner is going to be like forced to agree to their demands. Now, when you read this chapter, you're going to read about several strikes that are unsuccessful in the moment. There's going to be like 300,000 strikes that happen in America during this time period. And it's going to be kind of confusing to you that several of these strikes are going to fail. That's okay, because in the individual moment, some of these strikes are going to fail, but in the aggregate over time, over the course of decades of these strikes, workers are going to be better compensated and better treated. So this works in a long arc. It doesn't necessarily always work in the moment when you're reading about it. One final thing. Because big businesses control the government is going to support big businesses to break up these strikes. Several of these strikes that we're going to learn about are going to end with the US military coming in and firing at the people that are striking. So that's fun. Several times that's going to happen. Let's look at a couple of examples of these strikes. And remember, they might not be successful in the individual moment, but they are over the scope and sequence of this chapter. So the first type of labor union we're going to talk about is the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor is what is known as an unskilled labor union. So the problem with an unskilled labor union like this is that while the Knights of Labor is a very large labor union, they'll also accept anyone. And what's that old quote? I'd never want to join a club that would take me as a member. The basic idea being that if anyone's accepted to a club, then that club isn't really all that special. What did Syndrome say in The Incredibles? If everybody is super, no one is super? Well, that's kind of what happens to the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor is going to grow to have over 800,000 members. The problem is, not every one of those members is going to be as intellectual and erudite. If we're having a protest, you're going to have some people that show up that have their protest signs and stuff like that, but then you're going to have some people that show up with like a grenade. And that's actually what happens at the Haymarket riot, where a giant strike breaks out, but a couple members of the Knights of Labor get violent with some police officers, and then it basically becomes a riot that breaks out. Remember, protest is allowed in America so long as it's peaceful. The Haymarket riot, that's why it was called a riot, is no longer seen as peaceful. This labor union strike is now seen as a riot, and it's going to be suppressed by the government. So this is going to happen over and over. The problem with unskilled labor unions is that, well, you got to kind of accept anyone, and not everyone has the same negotiating power as everyone else. Let's look at a more successful labor union. So the American Federation of Labor is a skilled labor union. And this labor union is going to be significantly more powerful. Why? Well, the AFL is what's known as a skilled labor union, and the reason why it's more powerful is because skilled laborers are harder to replace. So again, not to talk bad on trash collectors, but technically what they're doing is driving a truck, hitting a button, and then that is picking up the trash. I could technically teach anyone to do that job. Not that anybody would want it, but I could teach anyone to do that job. So that's considered unskilled. Doesn't mean it's easy. In fact, usually it's a lot harder, but that's considered unskilled. Now, a skilled labor union like the AFL, think of it like me. I am certified, I am trained, I have, even among teachers, because I'm an AP teacher, not that that really means anything, but I have a higher certification and higher qualifications. I'm really hard to replace. If any one of your, I don't know, like your parents came in and substitute taught for a day, it would not be as good as if I was in the room, no matter how intelligent they are, right? Because they are not trained in the skill of teaching, right? So if I go on strike, or specifically if all the teachers at Bonita go on strike, we have a lot more power because we're a lot harder to replace. That's why the AFL is the more successful labor union. Now, the AFL is led by a dude named Samuel Gompers, pictured over here to the right. What a great name, Gompers. Gompers also comes up with this idea called collective bargaining. So the way it works is that rather than every individual employee having to negotiate their salary, instead, all of the employees will agree to the same contract. That's collective bargaining. So what does that mean? Well, here at Bonita, in Bonita Unified, there's like 1,000 teachers at all the schools. So rather than the superintendent having to talk to every single teacher about their salary, instead what we do is we have a contract that every single teacher agrees to. So whatever's in that contract, we all agree to. And that makes it really easy for us to add new members to the contract. And it makes it really easy for any boss, like Mr. Ritchie or whatever, to know what's expected of every employee. That's collective bargaining. The AFL comes up with it. It's pretty awesome. That's how things work. The AFL is going to fight for many of the things that we take for granted today, like a 5-day work week, 8 hours a day, overtime pay. Without groups like the AFL and without labor unions, we would still be working 7-day work weeks, 14 hours a day. It's a shame because union membership has kind of gone down in America for a couple of reasons. So, if you're an employer, how do you stop a strike? So you own a business, how do you stop a strike? Well, there's a couple ways. The first way would be using something called a yellow dog contract. So this is a labor contract that specifically forbids you from ever joining a union. You sign on to work at this business and you agree that you will never join a labor union. Some businesses actually have something like this to this day, where they basically force their employees to never join a labor union. The other way that you do it is through something called scabs. So scabs are non-union employees that break a strike. So let's just say the union's going on strike. What a business will do is they'll bring in a bunch of workers to work temporarily as scabs to keep the factory open while the negotiation's going on. And usually scabs will work for very, very low wages. So those are two ways that you can break a strike. Now, to go back to the point I was just making, labor union decline. Labor unions are going to go into decline, and there's going to be a lot of consequences that happen to the American worker ever since. Worker compensation, by which I mean how much you get paid for work, has actually been flat. And because of this thing called inflation, that means that your compensation for your job, while you might look like you make, let's just say, a 6-figure income, well, because of inflation, 6-figure income doesn't mean what it used to. And what ends up happening here is that while the average American employee is a significantly more productive and can make significantly more stuff in the matter of a working day, like when it comes to productivity, I am technically 3 times more valuable of an employee than my grandfather was. Now, granted, technology is what's helping that happen, but I'm technically more valuable of an employee as my grandfather, 3 times more. However, if you look at compensation for the same 8 hours of work, my grandfather made more an hour than I do. So I am 3 times more productive than my grandfather, but he got paid more than me. What happened? Well, labor unions went away. You can see it kind of here in the chart. So union membership is going down, which means that workers have less collective power to fight for their rights. And remember, every business is always motivated to pay workers as little as possible. So as labor unions have gone away, it's actually hurting the average American worker more than it's helping. Interesting, right? That's how things go. Okay, random topic jump. So now your textbook's going to take a random right turn into a wall for some reason and start talking about Native Americans. It makes sense in context because this is the time period where the Native American story kind of ends, but it seems kind of strange that the textbook just starts talking about growth of big business and all that kind of stuff, and then immediately starts talking about Native Americans and then goes back into big business. It is kind of confusing. Just roll with it. You'll be okay. So let's go back in time to discuss Native Americans out west, and we'll bring it back up to the current era that we're in. So if you remember, Americans are going to move out west to the frontier. The Homestead Act of 1862 is designed during the Civil War to settle the American frontier, right? This Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, North and South Dakota, really all the way to the West Coast region. This act is going to give 160 acres of land. And remember, an acre is roughly the size of a football field. Now, we'll talk about what happens to the farmers out there later, but for now, all we have to know is that as these Americans start moving out west, they start running into Native Americans, the ones that we had previously sent over to this region. Well, now the Americans are going to be running into them again, and the American people are going to want protection and their safety. They're going to expect the government to protect them. So how is that going to happen? Now, the frontier is this romanticized, mysterious, mystical place. The way to think of the frontier is kind of imagine Big Thunder Mountain Railroad at Disneyland. It's seen as this wild, fun, free from the government, carefree place. It's kind of determined to be romanticized. And what I mean by that is that people tend to have a more cheery outlook on what they think it is versus what it really is. In reality, the frontier is brutal, it's harsh, it's uncaring. Nature is uncaring whether or not humans live or unalive themselves or whatever. I don't know what the phrase is anymore. Nature doesn't care if you're alive or dead, right? So the frontier is basically free from the government, but it's also free from government help, and it's free from the help of others. So we've romanticized this region to say it's super awesome and great, but really it's kind of terrible. But that's how we encourage Americans to move out to this region. That kind of stinks. Can you imagine someone saying, wow, the greatest, most amazing place, scenic vistas, nothing but opportunity, Oklahoma. If you have ever been to Oklahoma, you know that nobody would ever describe it as a great land of opportunity, right? And it also wouldn't be described as having interesting physical features either. That is a romanticized view. It's basically like the Instagram filter of, America. So this leads to an interesting question. Who is an American anyway? Part of the reason why the American frontier is seen as so important is because the American frontier gives America an opportunity. Here's what I mean. There's this dude, his name is Frederick Jackson Turner. He is a historian, and he poses a really interesting question about where does an American come from? Now, if you look around, normally I'd say look around the classroom, but we're all American, right? Well, how do you make an American? What makes Americans so different from, like, I don't know, the French or Brazilians or, I don't know, what's that, some other like godforsaken place? Australians, right? So how do we differentiate ourselves? Historian Frederick Jackson Turner says it's actually the American frontier that makes Americans. This is a quote. It's actually a 20-page paper. Here is his thesis. American social developments have been continually beginning over and over again on the frontier. This perennial rebirth, this fluidity of American life, this expansion westward with its new opportunities, its continuous touch with the simplicity of primitive society, furnish the forces dominating the American character. What the heck does that mean? Here's what he's saying. What makes an American is being away from the government. So not having anyone having direct immediate authority over you is when you become an American, right? Having this place that Americans can go to without government oversight is what makes an American an American. And the concern that Frederick Jackson Turner has is if we run out of new land, if we run out of places for you to be away from the government, you're never going to become a true American. The other way to think about this is, be honest, are you a slightly different person when your parents aren't around? Like, your parents are going to go out to dinner with their friends or whatever, and you have the house to yourself. I don't mean you're going to just sit and break a bunch of laws, but like, maybe, I don't know, you're going to have ice cream for dinner or something, right? You become a slightly different person when you're not under the authority of someone else, if they can't see what you're doing. And if you never experience that, you never become your own person. You always become the person that the authority figure wants you to be. Frederick Jackson Turner is saying that if we run out of places as Americans to develop this personality, we're actually going to run out of Americans. That is what an American is. They're fiercely independent. An American on the frontier is capable of surviving without the government's help. So the concern here is that if there is no individualistic place for Americans to become individuals, I should say, there's no Americans. The isolation on the frontier is what makes an American. Now, we don't really have a frontier anymore. And I'm going to go ahead and guess that you all think you're an American, right? So maybe Frederick Jackson Turner is wrong. But this does pose an interesting thought discussion for us as we consider what is an American, what is American culture. I don't think Frederick Jackson Turner is entirely wrong here. What makes an American is independence, right? That's kind of our whole vibe. If you never have the opportunity to practice independence, how can you really ever call yourself an American? Huh. Okay, anyway, let's go back to the Native Americans here. Now, the problem here is that the Native Americans that are on this frontier, specifically in this region, in the North and South Dakota region, they're going to be a little concerned as white people start moving into their land. And what happens if Native American tribes start fighting against each other? Here's where it happens. It happens out on the plains. So in North and South Dakota, there are several Native American tribes that we kind of send out into this region. One of them are known as the Pawnee, and another type are known as the Sioux. So these are two Native American tribes. Now, the Pawnee are a small, relatively peaceful farming tribe, and the Sioux are a warlike nomadic tribe. The Sioux are going to be following buffalo across the Great Plains, and the Pawnee are going to be kind of chilling in one spot. What ends up happening here is that the Sioux natives are going to run into the Pawnee natives, and they're going to start fighting each other. And there becomes this big giant question of, well, like, what do we do if the Native Americans start fighting each other? And by the way, all of these natives are going to be fighting the white settlers too. So what do we do? The government comes up with this idea known as the reservation system. Essentially what's going to happen here is rather than shove all the Native Americans together in one region, what happens here is the US government sets up little reservations or little districts that are going to be under the control of an individual tribe. So For a tribe like the Pawnee, this isn't that big of a deal because they're relatively they're like a farming tribe. They don't need to move. But for a tribe like the Sioux, this is going to be a really big problem because they follow animals. And it turns out that buffalo don't just chill in one given spot. Buffalo like to roam. Perhaps you've heard the song? Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope graze. Play? Oh, crud. I don't know the words. Mullen, you have a beautiful voice. I know. Thank you. Maybe you do as well. So, there's still some issues with the Native Americans, even on reservations, specifically among the Sioux. The Sioux are not happy, and they start attacking more and more white settlers who they don't like encroaching on their land. And to be fair, it is land that they were promised. And, well, let's talk about Buffalo really quick because it's going to matter. What needs to happen here, and again, this is going to sound very harsh, but the white Americans need to essentially wipe out the Native Americans. So how do they do it? Well, they've already been doing it with smallpox, right? And they've already been doing it through things like that and other diseases. Smallpox is not the only one. What starts to happen next is that the American people are going to start attacking the buffalo or the bison. What ends up happening here is that the Native Americans are essentially reliant on the buffalo for survival. Buffalo are seen as sacred to Native Americans. They use every part of the buffalo in rituals and for food and for their lives. Buffalo are sacred to Native Americans. They're actually kind of seen as like the forefathers of Native Americans in a lot of ways. And interesting side note, buffalo are actually pivotal to the development of this land. And what I mean by that is that this region is naturally kind of a desert region, but the buffalo, what they would do is they would roll in the dirt to get bugs off of them and stuff like that, and they would form divots in the dirt. And then when it would rain, those divots would actually hold water better than the soil would naturally, and they would form little ponds, and those little ponds would help develop life and help develop green and grasses and stuff like that. Turns out that a lot of the North American geography and biology and stuff like that is based off of buffalo. So what does the white man do? The white man decides that if the Native Americans are reliant on this animal to survive, that if we want to get rid of the natives, let's get rid of their food source. And what starts to happen is a systematic destruction of the buffalo herds. There were hundreds of millions of buffalo in the year 1800 in North America. By the year 1912, there's basically 30 of them left. In fact, perhaps you've heard of something called a buffalo nickel. The buffalo nickel was made to remind Americans that this animal once existed. Yeah, historical side note, the buffalo that was used for the buffalo nickel, that was the model for it, was later slaughtered for meat. The point is, if you want to get rid of Native Americans, you wipe out their food source. Now, the bigger issue here is that now that we're wiping out the Native American food source, now there's going to become a systematic singling out and destruction of the Native American people. So to protect the settlers that are moving west, the U.S. government is going to basically try to kill all of the natives that remain. I'll tell a famous story because, this is a U.S. history class. I'll tell a famous story. There's going to be a couple of famous battles that happen between the American Army and the Native Americans. This is called the Native American Wars, actually. Sitting Bull is a leader of the Sioux Indians, and he's basically going to be fighting the American Army in this region. We send out an American general with a couple of troops. His name is General George Custer, and he gets involved in a big battle. It's called Custer's Last Stand. I bet you can guess why. The natives call this battle the Battle of Little Bighorn. But what ends up happening here is that this regiment of the American Army essentially gets slaughtered by Sitting Bull. What happens after that? Well, in response to Sitting Bull slaughtering Custer, What ends up happening is that the US government is going to send even more troops into this region to slaughter even more Native Americans. Eventually, the last major Native American war, the last major Native American battle, is called the Battle of Wounded Knee. And it's essentially a slaughter of this Native American tribe, mostly women and children, by the way. We like to call this the end of Native American resistance. And what I mean by this is that the Native Americans have essentially been depopulated through smallpox. Their life source of food is going to be taken from them, and they're going to be slaughtered by the US Army. Essentially, there's going to be very few Native Americans even left, and it's at this point that they basically just stop fighting, and they accept whatever life that the United States government decides to give them. It's a pretty sad, tragic story. But just like every tragic story, we're going to make it one level worse. To make matters worse, after taking away everything else from the natives, the Americans are going to take away their culture. In 1887, a law is passed called the Dawes Severalty Act. This law was essentially designed to forcibly civilize the Native Americans. Native American children are going to be captured by the US government, specifically the Army, and they're going to be taken to these re-education schools. We wouldn't bother taking adults because adults are set in their ways. Instead, we would take children, and we'd take them away from their families, and we would force them to go to these schools where they would be forced to cut their hair, which, by the way, most Native Americans only cut their hair when they are in a state of mourning. So we'd force them to cut their hair, we'd force them to dress in a European style, we'd force them to speak English, we'd force them to practice Western religions and basically forget about their culture. We'd force rival tribes to have people intermarry, and then after about a couple of years of living with the white man, we'd send the kids back to their families. And that way they could go to their families and say, like, you guys are all terrible, blah, 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 you're living wrong. Essentially, part of why we call this the Dawes Severalty Act is it wipes out Native American culture. How complete is this? Let's think about this. When's the last time you've been out to dinner and you've seen a Native American family? You live on Native American land. I already proved earlier in the school year that you don't know the name of the tribe, right? But like, when's the last time you've just seen a Native American family out at like Applebee's or whatever? You haven't, right? I mean, think about that. That is the story of Native Americans. They've essentially been systematically wiped out by the US government, and now they don't even really seem to exist anymore. It's a really horrible story when you sit back and think about it. Now, why do we even know a lot of this story? Well, a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson is going to write a book about this story. It's called A Century of Dishonor. By the way, you're looking at her waterfall. She had a little cabin by this waterfall. That's where she wrote the book. And in this book, she details what happened to the Native Americans and how it was systematically done by the US government. And this is really going to kind of expose to the American public what is going on when it comes to the treatment of the Native Americans. Again, kind of like how with slavery, the average Northerner probably didn't know what was going on. Similar with Native Americans, the average American might not have really known what was happening and how systematic it was until Helen Hunt Jackson writes her book and basically explains it to the American people. And that's kind of the end of the Native American story, as sad as that is. So let's switch gears. And now, let's talk about the last thing we have to get through this chapter. Let's talk about immigration. Surely this will be a happier story. Let's find out together. Okay, so during this time period of industrialization, sorry, I'm trying to find my notes about this. Maybe I'll just make it all up. So during this time period of vast industrialization, we're also going to have a huge increase in immigration that's going to happen during this time period. Put it to you this way. From 1870 to 1900, nearly 11 million immigrants enter the United States. So there's a halt in immigration during the Civil War because, you know, the Civil War is happening. But once the Civil War is over, there's going to be a lot of immigrants that try to come to America. The problem here is that, as we know, every group of immigrants is going to be less appreciated than the Americans who are already here. What is it about immigrants that makes them so not liked during this time period specifically? Let's make a little T-chart. So on the left, we're going to talk about what we call old immigrants. And then on the right, we're going to talk about new immigrants. Let's focus on the left. So old immigrants were more likely to be Western European, which means they're probably more familiar with what the American culture is. They're more likely to be from wealthy and literate families, and they might even come over as a full family unit, which is pretty awesome. Because they are literate, they're more likely to be skilled workers. America always wants skilled workers because they provide something that we might really need. Old immigrants were more likely to have experience with democracy, which helps, and they are more likely to be Protestant. So what's the problem after 1870? What's the problem during this time period with these new immigrants? These new immigrants are more likely to be Eastern European or Irish, which is worse. I can say that, I'm Irish. The other big problem with this new group of immigrants is that they are mostly impoverished, illiterate males. The United States doesn't need more dudes, right? Especially during this time period. The US doesn't need more dudes, especially impoverished, illiterate ones. We are never going to be super excited to bring in a bunch of illiterate males. We're like a club. It's always ladies' night in the United States in the club, but we're not super excited about a bunch of impoverished males. Because they're impoverished, they're more likely to be unskilled. And because they're unskilled, again, unskilled workers are going to work for less money. They're going to be seen as less valuable and less desirable. A bigger problem here, though, is that most of these immigrants that come to America during this time period have no desire to assimilate. They don't want to join the dominant American culture. And because they don't want to join the dominant American culture, they're going to be very disrespected and not liked. So, for example, you want to come to America, well, then you got to, support the team, as it were. There's nothing worse than a new kid comes to Bonita and they still wear the gear from their old school. It's like, come on, bro, you're here at Bonita now. You got to support the team. Or I don't know, if someone moves into the region and they don't want to support the Angels, or God forbid the Dodgers, right? Hey, you're in LA now. It's time to support the LA teams. No one here roots for the Chiefs. Barf. Anyway, another big problem here, especially with the Irish, is that they're more likely to be Catholic or Jewish. The United States tends to not be super excited about Catholic immigrants, mainly because Catholicism is seen as a different branch of Christianity, and Jewish immigrants are also going to be not really all that welcome here in America. They're not going to be welcome in a lot of places during this time period, but that's a spoiler for a later chapter. I think you might know where that's going. So here's a statistic there at the bottom. The US goes from having 30,000 Catholics before the Civil War to having 1.6 million by the year 1890. You can imagine the resistance that might happen and the change that might happen as you have this one group that's dominating America, Protestants, being challenged by this other group that doesn't want to follow the same type of Christianity. You can see why that might become a very big issue culturally. Now, whenever we talk about immigration, we have to talk about push and pull factors. So push and pull factors, a push factor is what pushes somebody out of their native country, and a pull factor is what brings them into America. So why are these immigrants coming here? Why are they leaving? Okay, there's a couple reasons. One, Europe is overpopulated. And not only is Europe overpopulated, but part two of this is that it's impossible to own land in Europe. If you are an illiterate, impoverished, unskilled laborer, a good way to make money is to be a farmer. At least you can feed yourself, right? Well, there's no farmland available in Europe, so a lot of people are going to be coming here looking for work because they can't get it in Europe. There's also going to be a really bad famine that breaks out in Europe. There's going to be one of several potato famines in Ireland. But there's actually going to be a larger crop failure happening throughout all of Europe. People are starving. So when you're starving, you're going to leave Europe and you're going to try to come to a place where there is food. There's also going to be a lot of what we call industrial depression in Europe, which means that there's going to be a very lack of availability of jobs in Europe during this time period. So those are the push factors. What are the pull factors? Pull factors are what brings you into America. So what's so great about America during this time period? Well, we got food, we got farmland. Even though we're not super psyched about having a bunch of unskilled laborers, we do have a lot of factory jobs available here. And America just finished our big war. We're relatively peaceful during the 1870s to the 1890s, so long as you're not native. So it's a relatively peaceful time to come here. So that's what's going to be pulling these immigrants into America. Now, last bit of the story, and then we are done with these two chapters. I just spoke a lot about European immigrants. The thing is, of the 11 million immigrants that come to America during this time period, 10 million of them come from Europe. 1 million of them come from Asia. And the immigrants that are going to get a majority of the nativism, and the immigrants that are going to get a majority of the racism, and the immigrants that are going to get a majority of the hatred expressed towards them are going to be Asian. Now, there are a couple of factors as to why. We'll talk about some more of them in class so this video doesn't get demonetized. I don't make money off of this, sorry. It doesn't get taken down by YouTube. They change their whatever all the time. So the bigger concern here is that a majority of the ire that's going to be faced towards immigrants are going to be focused rather unjustly on Asians. And what I mean by that is that like places like Japan they really only send out their best and brightest to other countries during this time period. So like a Japanese immigrant is essentially going to be like the valedictorian of the country coming here. And that's actually true for a lot of Asia. The problem here, though, is that these Asian immigrants are going to be immediately persecuted against. How do I know that? Well, in 1882, the United States writes a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this law specifically bans all Chinese, and I put that in quotation marks because like this really should have been called the Asian Exclusion Act. The average American is not going to make the time to distinguish between someone that's from Korea versus Japan versus China versus the Philippines. All Chinese, right? That's essentially going to be how this law is written. Anyway, that's how that's going to work. The Chinese Exclusion Act doesn't only exclude the Chinese. It basically excludes anyone from Asia. We're going to read the law in class, but the basic idea is that this law makes it illegal for an Asian person to come to America, and it kind of takes away the citizenship from the Asians who are already here. It's a pretty hardcore law, and what's crazy about it is this law is going to be in effect until 1943. Yeah, this is going to be going on for like 60 years in America. Okay, that's where this chapter kind of stops. I know it seems kind of strange. It'll make more sense in the long run. We're going to look at some videos, read some documents in class that go over this in more detail. I hope that you found this useful or helpful in some way. Class is always better, but this is something. I wish you the best of luck on your test. And if I'm remembering correctly, this might be the end of the first semester. So congratulations for finishing the end of the first semester. Bye.